Welcome to Across Africa, our weekly look at stories from across the continent. I'm Georgia Calvin-Smith, and this week, 6 of the top 10 countries in the world with the highest suicide rates are in Africa. Awareness and political will to tackle the problem across the continent is growing, but the response has to be multifaceted and compassionate. I speak to a top psychiatrist about what support is needed. Also, Kigali invites celebrities and bigwigs from around the world to join in a baby gorilla birthday party. Every year, the youngest of the protected apes are thrown a bash that Rwanda hopes can also serve as effective PR. And in Ethiopia, many farmers who've long relied on sales of their crops of cat are struggling to get by as the price of the leaves has plummeted. But first, World Suicide Prevention Day was marked on September 10th. It is a crucially important issue for the continent, as Africa sadly has the highest average suicide rate globally. 6 of the 10 countries in the world with the highest rates are on the continent, with Lesotho right there at the top. There is a push for more infrastructure, more openness, more awareness, and more tools to prevent suicidal deaths in Africa. Professor Taiwo Latif Sheikh, the Africa coordinator for the Lifeline International Charity, told me more about why Africa's suicide rate is quite so high.
The suicide rates across Africa is the highest among all the other continents in the world. However, it is very important that we understand that the factors involved are so many, but I'll mention quite a number because of time. What is common among the low-income countries where suicide is very high is the commonality of the what we call social determinants of suicide. You find this across all the low-income countries, but it's highest in the African continent. And this social determinants includes things like poverty, especially lack of purchasing power, unemployment, civil strife and terrorism, human rights abuses, and so on. These are social determinants that you find very high on the African continent. We also know that over 90% of cases of suicide are related to mental health conditions. And in Africa, access to quality and effective mental health intervention is very, very limited. Because of very obvious reasons, lack of availability of mental health services and barriers to uptake of such mental health services in Africa is also very poor. So where you have mental health conditions as an indicator for suicide, and you have lack of availability of access, barriers to uptake, you will also likely to have very high level of suicide in Africa. And then I also need to mention that Africa is a youthful continent, and suicide among the youths, especially between the ages of 15 and 29, is highest in Africa compared to other continents in the world. And because Africa is a youthful continent, and you have very high suicide rate among youths, then it's likely going to be very high on the African continent. So there are other issues that are related to this high number of percentage of suicide on the continent, which also include the issue of criminalization of suicide. Where suicide is criminalized, people don't come forward to uptake services available. People don't discuss it openly, and this can also lead to increased number of suicide on the continent.
Now, when it comes to the issue of criminalization of suicide, you were mentioning to me earlier that you're particularly concerned about how that poses an impediment to the continent's ability to bring down those suicide rates. And you were saying that it also gets in the way of a more compassionate approach that you believe is more culturally consistent with the region. Can you tell us a bit more about that, please?
Yes, criminalization of suicide is foreign to Africa. It's a legacy left behind by the colonial governments, especially English-speaking African countries. They all have this criminalization of suicide in their Criminal Code Act. And culturally in Africa, Africans abhor suicide. Religions in Africa abhor suicide. Traditions in Africa abhor suicides. But when it comes to people who try to take their lives by suicide, African culture is more compassionate. They support them, they try to help them to survive and not to allow them to die by suicide. So it is a strange law that is very, very non-compassionate, that is very cruel among Africans. The colonial rulers who left us with this law have gone ahead to change their own laws and decriminalize suicide in their country. It is very important that we also align with the culture of Africa, compassionate way the Africans treat people who try to harm themselves, and expunge these laws from our criminal code act.
Professor Tayo Latik Sheikh there speaking to me a little earlier on. Now, in Ethiopia's eastern region of Oromia, entire towns depend on the sale of intoxicating cat leaves. In 2020, its production accounted for 4% of Ethiopia's export earnings. But the price of the plant has dropped since, putting many farmers and sellers out of business. Clotilde Azar reports from Awede.
Cat leaves as far as the eye can see. Eastern Oromia is one of the world's most popular places for producing cat. But farmers have been hit by a drop in prices.
We can't even send our children to school anymore, so they have to stay on the farm because the price of cat has dropped. We used to sell a single kilo for 10,000 or even 20,000 birr. Now it's only sold for 2,000.
Once cultivated, the stimulant leaves are sent here to Awede, where they are sold locally and exported to neighbouring countries. Traders here say the crisis began last October, when regional authorities doubled the export price for cat and put in place checkpoints to collect the money.
For those working in the cat business, our main demand is to remove the checkpoints. We can no longer export to the places where we used to.
Ramzi Abdallah exports the crop. He used to employ 14 people, but he's had to let half of his staff go. He says that cat is the backbone of the local economy.
It's not just the buyers and the sellers who make a living from it. There are also those who clean the plant, those who carry the bags. That's why we tend to say that cat is our life.
But alternatives to cat are possible, according to this researcher.
This makes a challenge, but the government can encourage on fruits, vegetables, and other plants which can be easily be growing up in semi-arid and arid area. So they require a dialogue, discussion with community.
The crisis, compounded by inflation, marks the end of the golden era of cat, which for decades enabled traders to make a fortune.
Now, there's a push for more solar-powered storage to be made available to farmers in Kenya. A huge amount of produce from the agricultural sector is lost through wastage, particularly among smallholder farmers who don't have access to kit to reduce post-harvest losses. Clarice Fortuné has more.
Watermelons, avocados, fruits that perish just within a few days of being harvested. Kenya's temperatures are to blame, and many don't have access to adequate cold storage facilities. Between 30% and 40% of produce spoils before it even reaches the market.
The major causes of post-harvest loss is how the produce is managed immediately after harvest. For example, if you have cereals, have they been dried properly before you store it? What facilities are you using for storage?
Cold rooms like these ones could help reduce losses. This Kenyan company now offers rural farmers solar-powered mobile cold storage facilities. It has won the backing of 12,000 farmers hoping to reduce post-harvest losses of fresh produce.
Solar energy is one of the free sources of energy that could reduce our operational costs. So we opted to use solar, which enables us to deploy anywhere.
The company also buys products from farmers and connects them directly with large distributors, making them less dependent on middlemen.
They say they're coming to collect our harvest, but then they come late, and our oranges are spoilt. Now we have Soko Fresh. They're doing really well and they pay us on time.
The business has now extended its services to fish farmers, also highly dependent on the cold chain.
Every September, Kigali celebrates the latest mountain gorilla birth. It was a star-studded event this year, with Rwanda extending invitations to celebrities who were asked to not only bestow names upon the baby apes, but also to champion a country that has faced recurring criticism from NGOs and the UN recently. Our team sent this report.
They are some of Rwanda's greatest treasures. 23 baby mountain gorillas have been born in the volcano's park since last September. Every year the country holds a ceremony for the newborn apes at the foot of the Virunga Mountains. Movie stars, business leaders and diplomats from all over the world have gathered, excited at having been given the privilege of naming the infant animals.
All your friends in the United Kingdom want to salute the government of Rwanda for the so many brilliant things which are being done in this great country.
The presence of the British minister reflects the UK's deepening diplomatic ties with Rwanda, where Westminster is hoping to send thousands of asylum seekers. For Kigali, the naming ceremony is an opportunity to present itself in a favourable light. The modern tradition began in 2005 and is an effective means of self-promotion.
The economy is connected to conservation and to tourism. And it's thanks to what we have done, including this beautiful ceremony. It's very, very important to make this ceremony international. We are calling all international visitors to come to Rwanda to visit the mountain gorillas.
In 2022, over 100,000 tourists visited the country's natural parks. Across Uganda, Rwanda and DR Congo, there are at least 600 gorillas distributed throughout the region.
When the alpha one moves, even wherever they are, they come and follow him.
Several armed groups operate around North Kivu in DRC, and it's been mired in a security crisis since March 2022. Instability that undermines efforts to protect the great apes.
For instance, for the wildlife, there is no borders. The security situation is one more difficulty for the preservation of the wildlife. So, of course, every effort has to be put into the betterment of the security situation.
Kigali has been accused by the United Nations of supporting the M23, the primary armed group behind the Congolese conflict. Rwanda has always denied these allegations.
Well, that's it for Across Africa for now. Thanks for joining us, and do so again if you can. Till then, take care.